Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Ask robtrek, where I try to answer your questions from the comment sections in my videos. And of course, if you ever have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below this video, and I'll do my best to answer them. So today is a follow-up to my last video when I tested the OM system's SAF performance versus the EM5 Mark III, which had the previous autofocusing system. And today we're going to be looking at the CAF in the OM-1 system, and again, compare that against the EM5 Mark III. All right, so let me give you a quick overview of the testing methodology. Basically, I put the cameras on a tripod. I used my 12-40 Pro lens at f2.8, and I zoomed it to 40 millimeters. And then I used LED lighting to illuminate the subject so I could get a consistent lighting. And again, it's also a DC powered LED light, so I don't get any flicker, because if the camera happens to try to autofocus when it's flickering on one of the lower cycles, it may misfocus. And then finally, my target is pretty much the same. I did create a couple of new targets, but I have basically a 20% gray triangle here against a 2.5% gray square, and then a white rectangular box inside with 0.05 millimeter lines. And I just use my inkjet printer to print it. And I'll put a link down below to the PDFs for these targets that I used. So if you want to try and duplicate the tests, you're welcome to try and see if you get similar results. All right, let's start out quickly by looking at the data from the last video where I was testing the SAF performance versus EM5 Mark III and OM-1. And basically what we found is that once you get enough light into the OM-1, it's going to acquire autofocus more often and give you more sharp images. But below a certain level, the OM-1 is not going to be able to autofocus. You can see I got virtually no locks and just nothing in focus. Versus the EM5 Mark III, I was getting autofocus locks all the way through this range of light. But the percentage sharp was, about half, right? Or less than half in many cases. And the only thing I changed in this chart from the last video was I'm dividing the number of sharp images I got versus the number of autofocus locks. So, 45%, etc. But essentially, I took 600 shots, 499 autofocus locks, 216 sharp, 283 false positives. So overall, 43% of the images were sharp once I got a focus lock. And on the OM-1, you can see I got 275 autofocus locks, but I got nearly as many sharp images and a lot less false positives and a much higher percentage of sharp images. So basically, like I said, once you get enough light, the OM-1 is outperforming the EM5 Mark III. Now, to give you some perspective of the lighting conditions that I'm dealing with, because it's hard to convey that from this chart, or even from the base exposure setting of 1 second f2.8 ISO 200. This setting here is just an equivalent setting. This is not the setting that I used. I used this setting for all of the tests that you're going to see in this video. And then I also downloaded a phone app to tell me how many lux there is on the target, and it really wasn't sensitive enough to detect below 1 lux. So I was getting readings of 1 lux, 2 lux, 6 lux, as you can see at the different light levels. And then here is another chart where I'm just basically, I put the camera in aperture priority and let the camera determine the shutter speed and ISO. And as you can see, we had to use very, very high ISOs to get a neutral gray or proper exposure. And now, one more thing I want to address before we move on is, and Robin Wong actually brought this up, and the data does sort of back up what he said, is when you half press the shutter button, you can usually see in the viewfinder that the image is out of focus. And you just have to half press the shutter button again, and more than likely you'll get a sharp image, right? Maybe 2 or 3 times, but effectively you will be able to get the shot. Whereas on the OM-1, no matter how many times you half press that shutter button, you are just not going to get a focus lock when the light levels are at this level. So just keep that in mind when we look at the new data. All right, so basically it's the same identical test, but this time I used CAF instead of SAF. And you can see that both cameras actually were able to acquire focus locks. However, when using CAF, the OM-1 again outperformed the EM5 Mark III by a significant margin. Just looking at the gross numbers, you can see we have 212 sharp on the EM5 versus 320 sharp on the OM-1. So we got less false positives, and we got a much higher percentage of images in focus at these various light levels. And just like before, the EM5 Mark III is a little bit inconsistent. The numbers just kind of go up and down, but stay in this range. Versus the OM-1, as the light levels increase, you get more sharp images. And this makes sense, right? So I think there's definitely an improvement in the OM-1 CAF autofocusing performance over the EM5 Mark III and over using SAF. As indicated here, we were able to acquire 100% focus locks, and a little less than half of those were actually sharp. And again, most of these were very sharp. I mean, I'd probably be happy with probably closer to 80-90% of the images for just my use to post on Instagram, etc. But for very critical focus, these are the numbers I got. And I was very, very critical, whether it was in focus or out of focus. All right, now someone suggested I try the OM-1 single point autofocus, and I just tested at the lowest light level here on my 20% gray triangle. And you can see that in SAF mode, I got a lot less sharp than I did when I used CF mode. But I don't think you should draw any conclusions from this test, mainly because of my testing methodology. Because I was using an intervalometer, and basically what it does is it mashes the shutter button down for 3 seconds. And when you're in SAF mode, it really only scans one time, back and forth, to try to find contrast, to get focus and lock in. Versus in CF mode, when you're mashing the shutter button for 3 seconds, you can hear the autofocusing system, constantly jittering back and forth to try to find contrast and lock focus. So it's really trying multiple times in that 3 seconds, versus SAF is really only trying one time to find focus. And I think that's why the number here is much higher. So don't put any weight into this test thinking that maybe SAF is not as good as CAF. I don't think it really applies here, but I did the test just to see the results I would get. Now down here, I did my bird on a stick test, and same exposure, 1 second, f2.8. And I put in here some equivalent exposures using different lenses. So if you were using a 300mm lens, I wouldn't use less than 1/250th of a second to take a picture of a bird on a stick, and that's pushing it. But you can see at these light levels, you'd have to be at 100,000 ISO. So this is very, very low light shot again, right? And here's an equivalent 40-150 Pro lens. You could probably get away with 1/125th of a second at f2.8, but you'd have to be at ISO 25,000 to use the shutter speed. So, this is a pretty tough test, right? Very low light for bird on a stick type photography. But what I did here is I turned on all focus points. I turned on bird detect, 100 shots, 97% sharp, only 3 false positives. And again, these were very close. Like, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference really just at first glance that these were out of focus, but they were just a tiny bit. And it, obviously it had no problem finding the bird very quickly and locking focus every time. Now, you'll see a negative 0.3 here. For whatever reason, when I was using bird detect, I was getting a slightly negative exposure value on the meter, but my exposure settings were exactly the same for both these tests. And then I switched to a small area and I turned off bird detect, where I just put the box right over the bird's head here. And I got the same exact numbers, which makes sense, right? Bird detect is just sort of an AI thing to find the bird and put the focus points on the bird, versus small area, you're just doing it manually, right? So I wouldn't expect the numbers to be different. Now in CAF, again, we're mashing the shutter button down for 3 seconds. And the numbers are a little bit lower here, but I wouldn't draw too much from that either. I mean, if I did 1,000 clicks, I bet these numbers on the top and the bottom would sort of average out to be virtually the same. But overall, I think this is really an excellent performance considering the lighting conditions for birds, right? Or any kind of subject that has contrast at all, unlike this 20% gray target. All right, now I did one more test and I created a different target. This time I made 4 10% gray triangles. And I put the focus area over these 4 triangles on both cameras. And you can see that the EM5 Mark III at 63% is still outperforming the OM-1 at 54% in SAF mode. But the OM-1 is now acquiring autofocus locks in these lower light levels, whereas before it virtually was not able to lock onto anything. And I attribute this to the way the autofocusing system is working, because if you look in the menu, you'll see a setting for center priority when you choose a group area. But basically, the autofocusing system is scanning the entire area, but now it has 4 times as many triangles to try to acquire autofocus on. And even though these are lower contrast triangles, it's working a lot harder, right? It has more things to try to look at. So I think that's why we were getting better performance with this target versus the other target, which only had one 20% gray triangle. But that said, the EM5 Mark III is still outperforming the OM1. But just like before, if you have pressed the shutter button a second time, you're more than likely you'll get the shot in focus. And you can do that with the OM1 just as easily as you can with the EM5, right? Now in CAF, the M5, the performance dropped a little bit. So you can see we got a lot less, 100 less images sharp using CAF on the M5. But on the OM1, we actually got about 50 more shots sharp using CAF. So it's marginally better, right, using CAF than it is SAF. Not by much. And again, if I were to do thousands of clicks instead of 400, these numbers would probably average out to be about the same. Oops, for some reason I deleted that. But I felt this test would be kind of useful. Now I have one more test here, and I just did it for the M5 Mark III. I was just too tired to do it again for the OM1. But I would expect the results wouldn't be too dissimilar than one we just saw at the 10% gray. But these are 2.5% gray triangles here, and then I did it for 5% gray triangles. And as expected, as you add more contrast to the image, you start to get more sharp images. Now, another thing that's come up is some people had said that using the magnify feature does give you better performance. And it's really because it operates a little bit differently. So right now I'm in the small point, right? And I'm in decent light levels here, as you can see from the exposure settings. But I'm able to lock in without any problem. And I'm in CAF. If I go to SAF, you can see now it's struggling, right? So again, it seems like the CAF does perform better than SAF in this situation. But let's look at the magnify. So I'm going to click on my magnify button here that I've programmed. And you can see that I have a little bit of that 20% gray triangle in the box there. Basically, when you press the magnify button, it expands the focus area to everything within that green box, unless you zoom in. As soon as you zoom in, like by clicking the magnify button again, you can see it punches in, and now it's going to that single point there inside the little gray rectangle, and it's struggling. But if I move this over just a tiny bit so that it can grab a little bit, now it can focus on the contrasty part of that triangle. But if I move it over, you can see it's struggling again. And this is in CAF mode. If I do it in SAF mode, let's go ahead and go into magnify. And it's really not doing any better than using the single point. And then let's magnify. Now we're on single point, and we're not in a contrasty area. But if I move it over a tiny bit, you can see now it's not having any problem. So basically the magnify feature expands the focus area to try to grab more contrast. So it's going to appear to work better in some cases, but it's really more useful for trying to pinpoint that focus, that single point, onto a bird, say, for example, in between branches and things where, it might be hard to navigate using the joystick when you're in the full view. Having a magnified view just makes it a lot easier to move that focus point to exactly where you need it to get the contrast you need to get autofocus. Now, of course, there'll be endless variations to how I can do this testing, different settings, different focus points, etc. And I'm sure there'll be endless debate about, how I did this testing. But let me just give you my opinion overall. And I feel like the autofocusing system in the OM-1 is superior to the previous autofocusing system in almost every practical way. And I'm basing that on the test results we've seen but also on my personal experience in using the camera, because I never would be able to do the kind of bird and flight type photography that I do now were it not for the amazing autofocusing system in the OM-1. So the question is this something that OM systems can maybe update in firmware so that the OM-1 outperforms the EM5 or the previous autofocusing system in every way? And I think ultimately the answer is yes. And I base this on the fact that, the OM-1, just like the EM1 Mark III did, has starry sky AF, where it's focusing in nearly pitch black conditions on the little pinpoints of stars, right? However, that takes 10 or 15 seconds to do that, right? If not longer. And that's because it's using a different autofocusing algorithm. So what if they can come up with an algorithm where it can autofocus in lower light, but still be reasonably fast, right? And lock focus. So what they might have to do is maybe add an additional autofocusing mode for low light, where it's more accurate, outperforms the M5 Mark III, and is still fast enough to be usable. Or can they tweak the current algorithm so that it detects when it's in low light situations and it shifts the autofocusing programming to work better? That's something for the engineers at OM Systems to figure out. I'm sure they will, but we'll see. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, if not informative, or not. I guess it depends, right? But either way, I do appreciate you watching. And if you have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And until then, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.